you know the famous P-47 Thunderbolt, the deadly ground attack aircraft and formidable dogfighter in World War II that was known for its ability to take a heavy beating from the enemy. But in this video, we will take a look at some things that you may not know, the fascinating details that have been often overlooked in history. So let's jump into 5 unknown facts about the P-47 Thunderbolt. To begin the countdown for today, we will take a look at the first confirmed aerial victory by a P-47 Thunderbolt. This would come at the hands of one of the most important individuals who flew a P-47 in Europe, Donald James Matthew Blakesley. Lacking the university degree required to fly for the U.S. Army Air Corps, Blakesley actually had to request to join the Royal Canadian Air Force for the first few years of the conflict. Here, he established himself as an incredible commander and a skilled pilot. As the war went on, Blakesley built a notable career as part of the No. 401 Squadron with the RCAF, reaching the status of ace by the end of 1942. He would soon be reassigned to an American unit, and in the spring of 1943, Captain Blakesley and his squadron reluctantly traded in their fast and agile Spitfires for the new resilient and bulky P-47. On April 15th of 1943, while flying over Belgium, Blakesley and his men came across a Luftwaffe squadron comprised of Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. The British, Canadian, and American pilots held their own, with the P-47 doing well in the ensuing combat and enduring a heavy barrage from the German fighters. In this engagement, Blakesley would draw one of the Focke-Wulfs off and pull up behind it. Here, he opened up with a burst from his new Thunderbolt, sending it spiraling to the ground engulfed in flames. This kill of a Focke-Wulf would be the first confirmed victory of the P-47 Thunderbolt, and would foreshadow the high success that the aircraft would tally in the years to come. Next, more often than not, the P-47 is remembered for its ability to save American pilots in combat. But at number 4, we will actually look at how this famous fighter greatly aided American lives in the United States. In the Indiana-Kentucky border along the Ohio River lies a city named Evansville, an industrial Midwest town famous for its production of cars and trucks. But in the 1930s, Evansville was heavily impacted by the Great Depression and the 1937 natural disaster of the Ohio River flood. After these events, Evansville struggled to recover until the start of the Second World War. Once the conflict began, demand for military equipment, weaponry, vehicles, and other vital manufacturing made Evansville a perfect place for contractors and builders to establish their factories and assembly lines. The need for fighter aircraft meant that Republic Aviation would have to choose somewhere to concentrate the production of their new P-47. And based on the geographics and history of the city, the floundering city of Evansville would be a perfect fit. So the company set up shop across from the local airfield and would bring the factories of the quiet city back to life. Republic would go on to produce nearly half of all the P-47s constructed, a total of 6,242 planes in the small city of Evansville. These factories gave thousands of locals jobs and created new opportunities for the residents of neighboring towns and states to find work as well. People and families flocked to Evansville in droves to take advantage of the opportunity, and the population would end up doubling in just a few years. Republic and the demand for the P-47 Thunderbolt ultimately saved the town's financial system and helped it regain a footing in the American economy during the war. One of the planes built in Evansville would even go on to play a major role in one of the following facts later in this video. Next up, we will look at a famous and funny quote from the designer of the P-47 that gives some perspective on his design and the thoughts of his iconic warbird. But before we look at the quote, we need to understand the proportions and size of this aircraft. The P-47 weighed nearly 10,000 pounds when empty, but could carry up to 3,000 pounds of 5-inch rockets or bombs. It was a massive but surprisingly fast single-engine fighter. And with its ability to serve in multiple roles and take a heavy beating from enemy fire, it earned the nickname Juggernaut, or the Jug for short. When compared to the popular fighters of the time, especially those of the enemy like the Bf-109 or the A6M0, one can see that the Thunderbolt is a far larger aircraft. It looks like it should be in a completely separate classification from these planes. Because of this, the designer of the plane, Alexander Kartveli, would be quoted with saying one of the most accurate yet humorous statements on the P-47 as it was being developed. He would state, "It will be a dinosaur, but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." This was clearly a reference to the large size of the Thunderbolt. But despite the measurements of this massive fighter, the P-47 would not only be able to take a great beating in combat and carry a heavy payload, but also even dogfight with many of the most advanced aircraft of the war. At number 2, we will go to one of the more famous aircraft that would be produced from Evansville, Indiana. This would be a P-47 commonly known as Dottie May. Now, in combat, the P-47 was incredibly difficult to shoot down and was able to survive heavy damage. Over the course of the war, P-47s would take part in over 500,000 missions and would lose only 3,500 of their own. But one of the P-47s that would be lost was actually the famous Dottie May. One of the many Evansville P-47s, Dottie May was constructed in the summer of 1944 and served in the U.S. Army Air Corps' 9th Air Force in Europe. After taking part in over 90 combat missions, her last operation was carried out at the very end of the war in Europe, just 8 days after the suicide of Adolf Hitler. In this sortie, Lieutenant Henry Moore was taking part in an aerial demonstration over a concentration camp in Austria to try and increase the morale of the prisoners below as they waited liberation. But during these demonstrations, he flew too low over a nearby lake, and the aircraft struck the water. Moore successfully escaped the cockpit and swam to shore, but the aircraft sank into the Tronsee Lake. As the Germans would surrender the very next day, this would give Dottie May the distinction of being the very last combat aircraft to be lost in the war in Europe. Dottie May would remain there until June 13th of 2005, when she was recovered by the Sandy Air Corps and restored by vintage airframes. And finally, at number 1, we will look at the actual numbers of the incredible damage that the P-47 caused on its enemies. Although the Thunderbolt was certainly a formidable dogfighter, most historians would agree that its greatest asset was as a ground attack aircraft. It was able to carry a heavy load and was able to absorb a great amount of punishment from anti-aircraft, making it the ideal choice for this role. So, in the Second World War, the P-47 carried a huge portion of the ground attack assignments from the United States Air Forces. But just how much damage did it actually do during these missions? Despite only making its debut in the spring of 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt flew well over 500,000 sorties in both the European and Pacific theaters. In Europe alone, however, the Thunderbolt is credited with destroying approximately 86,000 railway cars, 68,000 trucks, and 6,000 armored fighting vehicles. These numbers are even more impressive when we remember that the total number of P-47s produced was less than 16,000. Because of the success of the Thunderbolt in this role, within a matter of 2 years, Allied pilots had demolished much of the German supply routes and military lines that had been vital for the war effort, crippling them on the Western Front and helping to bring about victory over Germany in 1945. Please comment what aircraft you think I should cover next and consider subscribing. See you next time.